Okay, well, it's been, I think we can all agree, a really fascinating day of discussion and very inspiring as well. We've had this incredible panel of very esteemed experts. I can't believe I'm so privileged as to introduce them today. Just to remind you of who we of course have Jamie Love, Professor Sir John Sulston, David Hammerstein, and Katy Athersuch of the MSF Access Campaign. And the work that they've done, the experience that they have, the knowledge they have, is oh so comprehensive. They are the best placed people to discuss where we're moving forward. So since I have the badge, any questions, ask me. Please address your questions and I'll pass them on to the panel. So, I've got a load coming up.
Hi, I'm Mark. I'm a medical student here and part of the UAEM campaign at UCL as well. So we've talked a lot about sort of more of a needs-based model, trying to approach a needs-based model in the pharmaceutical industry. And though it might be a bit of a pipe dream, I was wondering, what do you think about introducing potentially a nationalised pharmaceutical company, either a state-owned or something similar, that would be able to deliberately sort of plan a more needs-based system? Is that something that's at all feasible? And if it was, how would you see that sort of changing things?
Question about nationalised pharmaceutical R&D then. So who would like to start the response to that?
You want to take a group of questions first, maybe?
Good idea. Any more questions while we're on that? Yes?
My question was sort of relating to open source dividends that was mentioned by Jamie Love, but also kind of applies to all of the sort of pooled funding mechanisms. For them to work, you'd obviously need to have someone who sort of oversees it, measures the impact, and therefore then redistributes some sort of reward for doing that research and development. Do you think there's any sort of international institutions at the moment that could take on that role? Because obviously it would need to require faith both from the public and also from the pharmaceutical industry that they would be unbiased. So I'm just sort of, as a practical point, who do you think would be possible to be responsible for such a role?
Thank you. And sort of talk about that.
I've actually got two questions, just because I thought of something while Kush was talking. But first of all, I'd just like to ask, what you thought was the most successful, event, say, in terms of dealing with this problem in the past. So, just the reason for asking this question is so, looking back, maybe what can we learn from the most successful moment, so that we can apply that going forward. And then the second question was, I've forgotten it. So, yeah.
So while you're thinking of it, we'll take one last question and we'll hear from our panelists.
I have a question about the HIV/AIDS, and it's like recently, very many people are talking about a cure instead of the treatment. It seems like the treatment doesn't work so well. It prolongs life, or doesn't necessarily give you health or good immune system, something like that. So, what do you think is the main factor driving this research heating up? Like, is that research achievement or reward, or the public should need, or is the profit behind?
So your question is then, what is the main driving factor behind
driving this kind of research so heating up recently?
Thank you. Okay then, so those are our questions. Then we're looking at the feasibility and what a nationalised R&D regime might look like. Who provides the open source dividend as well? That question from over there. What has been the most successful moment in this area so far? And finally, what is it that really drives R&D?
I mean, specifically for the HIV cure.
Specifically for the HIV cure. Yes.
On the question of a nationalised pharmaceutical company, I'd like to turn that around. When we speak about delinkage, one way of applying delinkage in a structural way, not aside from prices, is what I call unbundling. I don't know if many of you know what has happened with utility companies or energy companies, at least in theory, where the attempt is, on a European level, is that no sector of the economy should control the whole cycle of production. So in an energy company, the coal mine, the electrical lines, yeah. So this is called bundling because they have a dominant position in the economy, is how they express. Nevertheless, we allow in the pharmaceutical industry, we allow big companies to control, either directly or indirectly through buying, the cycle of R&D, of clinical trials, of developing the medicine and marketing, which is really goes against the basic tenets of any kind of competitive economy. And we have European laws, for example, that have broken up the telephone companies. You know, the British Telecom only devotes itself, I think, for the infrastructures. It used to be, you know, mobile phones and fixed phones. Well, I think that the simile is very relevant, and especially relevant, even more so in the case of healthcare, where, so on nationalized thing, what I would demand is that, okay, you can have public companies, but what needs to be separate, it has to be, and the way the public can control the cycle is by separating the cycle. And then the big pharma companies that make the drug shouldn't be allowed to actually pay and buy the R&D. And maybe this is utopic, but nevertheless, I do agree with you that health is too important to be controlled in private hands. And if it was possible to have a nationalized company, yes. But as a first step, I would demand unbundling.
Thank you. Jim?
Is your voice active? Okay. I think that when it comes to, well, David, I think his point is that you sort of unbundle different things that drug companies do. I think it's important. Let me just start with the manufacturing side, which I think you're probably focused on R&D, but just on manufacturing side. Right now, there's a set of drugs which are small market drugs. They're off patent. There's some problems in the supply chain because they're just not considered profitable enough. And then there's some biologic products that have a lot of trade secrets associated with them, and it's very difficult to get low-cost generics just because of the way the procurement's kind of set up. And I think that governments have to take a larger, more direct role in being a manufacturer of certain drugs to which the generic and branded sector do not do a good job of providing reasonably priced drugs of acceptable quality. But on the R&D side, I think that centralization is kind of not really your friend in a lot of ways. And I think that you want a fair amount of contrarian thinking and independent thinking. And that is, I think, the sort of challenge that you face when people talk about nationalized decision-making. And that's actually one of the sort of probably positive features that the patent system has. The patent system enables independent decision-making by firms, independent of any kind of centralized authority. And I think people think that's probably valuable. I think that a counter to that is to really push on more competitive ways that nonprofit agencies can actually resource drug development efforts. The private system is one that's particularly designed to kind of fit into the private for-profit sector, but you can have competitive grant-making systems that work in nonprofit systems too. They're not as centralized. The system that Tim Hubbard and I have looked at is called competitive intermediaries, and that idea was that you'd have employers be required to give a contribution to a company or an entity which would resource R&D efforts of an open source type on drug development, but that you would, as the employer, be able to choose which intermediary you gave it to. So just in a simplified example, suppose there was like 4 different entities which were resourcing open source development. If either as the employee level or the employer level, if you had to make a contribution of 50 pounds or 100 pounds or something like that to that entity per employee, you could choose which entity that you gave the money to, and you would do it based upon your confidence that the person did now was doing a good job of finding researchers and placing their bets in a way that you wanted to. So you could have the benefits of competition and legitimized by the choice of the people from the bottom up, without having the sort of bad features of the grant of monopolies. So I think we're kind of thinking you need to kind of reinvent the way you do nonprofit drug development if you want to scale it up in a way that doesn't smack of kind of a centralized Soviet Union type innovation system.
Professor Sulston.
Just like to follow on what Jamie's saying here. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of the remark contrarian thinking. Well, universities are frightfully good at contrarian thinking. That's what we're paid to do. So my opinion is that if we were to, as people are beginning to talk about, getting a little further along the pipeline in that kind of situation, before you start talking about profit, we might do well. And so we have, you know, if you call, I don't know what you call it, phase 0 or phase 1 or the valley of death or something, but anyway, the bit that it seems to be hard to do, we need lots of contrarian thinking there, absolutely. We need to have university and research institutes driving through there before it gets taken out. I had my own little anecdote about that, not to do with drugs, but to do with software. I was persuaded when I was writing image analysis software, really for purposes of the nematode genome, but we had a spin out to start reading the gels, the roster radiographs. That time was being used for sequencing, and I was getting somewhere. You know, it's very exciting seeing this image analysis stuff coming up alive under my fingers. It was marvelous. It kept me going, you know, all through the weekends and the night. And it all went fine until the technology transfer officer said, look, we really have to sell this because you're getting somewhere. So they got Hammerstein in, and rather against my wishes, it was sold, I believe, to them. And what happened? They sent a guy down, he put privacy locks on all our computers and everything we were doing, and I couldn't figure out how to get it anymore, and I gave up. And I think that's an example of how the sort of corporate thinking impinges on exactly the kind of contrarian thinking that you want. So what I would ask is that we shoot for keeping that open contrarian thinking going a bit longer. And one other remark, we're still on this nationalised pharmaceutical thing. In fact, NIH is doing the experiment, are they not? Francis Collins has supervised the setting up of a pipeline, and how far is it going through? To phase 2 or something? A drug pipeline?
Yeah, I think the compromise he had to make is he had to stop the process at the point before he sort of monetized the benefits. But the industry doesn't mind the taxpayers paying for. Taxpayers already in the U.S. pay for about $7 billion a year of clinical trials at the NIH.
But it was a way of pushing things through that otherwise we get lost in this early
the
stage.
transitional things. That's true. The NIH is. Francis Collins wants to do it, but he kind of he's a politician. He tries to figure out how far he can go before pharma gets him fired, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But you see what I mean? I mean, I think we are seeing a little bit of a pilot, so we shouldn't just think of this as a pipe dream right now.
Thank you, Professor Sulston. Katy.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on some of the other questions actually, because I think other people have, just pulled down my notes, have come up with some responses on the nationalised industry. I think also we can look at things like Fiocruz in Brazil, or what the Indian government's doing, and investing quite a lot of their own money in these public research institutes. So there are some sort of examples of that going on. But even if you were to have a nationalised industry that was taking it all the way through, you probably have a problem then of I guess, benefit sharing in terms of, well, this country, I mean, at the moment we just all rely on the NIH. The NIH subsidises everything for everyone, and then US consumers not only pay the taxes for it, but then have to pay the highest prices anywhere in the world. But, you know, if we were to have something, say Fiocruz were to bring drugs all the way to market in Brazil, how would it be free for people in Brazil and not free for people outside Brazil? How would you work that out? Even one of the proposals for demonstration projects that's potentially going forward in some way or other at the WHO is by the Thai government, and they say, it's to develop a dengue vaccine. They say it will be fine for people in terms of access in Thailand because we have universal coverage and we will give it to everyone. For people outside, we'll try and work something out. So I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to go on, but I don't see why not. I wouldn't be completely opposed to it, but yeah, I don't have particularly strong views. I think what James said earlier about needing an ecosystem is probably useful. We don't just want one organisation doing everything. We need lots of different free thinking.
And with regards to that unbundling, as you said, David Hammerstein, we're looking at then at stepping stones potentially towards something looking more like a nationalised R&D regime.
No, it's not. Unbundling is not nationalisation.
No, but just, it might be the case that certain things are kind of, by their nature, more monopolistic than other things are. But what you observe is that people will use that one sort of chokehold that sort of leads to a lot of concentration, and then they'll try and use that to control the sectors that, it could be quite a bit more atomistic or, less concentrated. So that I think is, like just for example, on manufacturing, Big Pharma is a big customer of active pharmaceutical ingredients. And that's a much more concentrated market in the generics thing than the formulation and manufacturing of the product. And so when Thailand was trying to manufacture its own version of DDI, they wanted to buy the active pharmaceutical ingredients from a company. And so Bristol Myers contacted them. They said, if you sell to the Thai government, you'll lose all your contracts with us. And they did the same thing on Tamiflu with companies where they threatened to cut off. They sort of user control, is a big part. So you have these kind of, in competition there, you have this idea that these some things that are not elements of the market are not very competitive, particularly when patents are involved. And you have others that could be more competitive, and they try and leverage a monopoly in one layer to exercise all kinds of market power in a different layer, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I think the idea of unbundling is to create a clear playing field for real competition. And I think that should be extended to all sectors. I even think that a pharmaceutical company should not have interest in medical journals, because that would be part of unbundling. And when we think about the telephone company or the energy company, we are disturbed about the very things we ignore about the whole chain. I'm talking about not controlling the whole chain of production of the pharmaceutical. But that would need, like Jamie says, a lot of study to focus on where to break things up. But it's actually it's a competitive strategy.
Interesting enough, if people think of the big pharma companies as competitors, but if you look at a lot of drugs, you'll have a drug where, like Bristol Myers will be selling the drug in the United States, but maybe Pfizer will sell the same drug, or Roche will sell the drug outside the United States in a different market, and they'll have like so many cross-licensing agreements between them. I mean, they must meet, as competitors on Monday, and on Tuesday they're sitting down in their joint ventures working out their deals, and then they're competitors on Wednesday again, and you just don't know how they separate those roles.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to make a point. It reminded me of something I read in that nice book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, which is that apparently towards its end, or maybe it's not ended yet, General Motors is making 80% of its income from financial transactions. And I think there's a little bit about this, we're commonly saying pharmaceuticals are marketing companies rather than research companies, but they're also doing transactions, like you're saying, with all of this. And so it's very far removed from the idea of a straightforward pipeline.
As far as open source goes and open access, inside the European Union, inside the new program that started on January 1st of this month, which is called Research and Development of the European Union, called Horizon 2020. Have any of you heard of that? That's the 60, 70 billion euro program that goes up for the next 5 years. Well, there is, like I said, mandatory open access publishing that needs to be developed. And then there's also the promotion to make a standard over the next 5 years of open data. This means there will be incentives, economic incentives, for people who share their data if they are using European Union research money. And the intention is to extend this policy to what's called the European Research Area, which means all of the national research programs as well. That means in the UK and Spain as well, from public money as well. But that will depend. I know there's some exciting issues that Tim Hubbard told me about open access and sharing the genetic stuff here. But I think the open access, open source dividend in medical research is something we have to push on in individual programs that are being developed. We're doing that right now in the Innovative Medicines Initiative. The Innovative Medicines Initiative is one that is especially for neglected diseases and the development of antibiotics. And that's going to be discussed within the next few weeks in the European Parliament with specific amendments for sharing all of the data, for transparency, open data, with these public-private partnerships. Because for me, one of the most shocking things is we have fairly good PD product development partnerships where we give as taxpayers all of this money, but there are no strings attached to these PDPs. So there are no strings attached about the intellectual property, and there's no strings attached about the transparency where the money's going. So even people are doing great things against neglected diseases and antibiotics. We're not developing, so we have a chance that we're trying to push on the Innovative Medicines Initiative and some other issues. But what we do need to push, and I think we've tried in the past, is that on concrete programs like an open source innovation prizes, where we have little examples in the European Union, is when we get some ideas in the door, we are going to call on all of you to support and letter writing and trying to push these ideas forward. And the last question is that one important event. And I think the most important event was on HIV, AIDS, drugs, and those of you who've seen the film Fire in the Blood would know it very well, as far as the turning point of seeing a new paradigm.
Jamie Love, I know that you had comments on what David Hammerstein said, and then Professor Sulston will turn to you and Katy as well. So, if you want to take away.
Well, on my way, but I also wanted to respond on this evaluation issue for the open source data. Did you want to follow up that earlier point for a second? I can wait.
Well, maybe I'll do quickly what I was going to say, which is just following on what you were saying about past successful events. Sorry. Polio. Let's get back a bit further. And of course, it's easy to be naive because I know things were cheap there. And we didn't have a rule. The fact of the matter is that Jonas Salk genuinely said, "Would you have the sun?" And that's a reflection not so much of the man himself, though he was a great man, but the climate of the time. And I think it's important to realise how far we've dug ourselves into a contrary situation. The fact of the matter is that I've had many arguments with people. I had one in the last time I was in Brussels, for example, with this MEP guys. And most of the scientists who make important discoveries do not need incentivization, nor, frankly, I suspect, do most of the developers. So I think we ought to be very clear on this incentivization stuff. If we have more or less an existing model, then right, you do have to perhaps have the monetary incentives and move to a different position, because you're still talking about shareholders, aren't you? You're talking about companies competing and so on. If we move to the other sort of model, you get all these benefits coming along as well, the nationalised kind of thing, where people are going for kudos for having cured a disease. And this is why people work for MSF, right? They don't work for money. They work because they want to cure disease. And I do think we shouldn't mince our words about this, about how important it is to start getting back to a situation where people are motivated by things other than money.
So if you could...
I guess, so a couple of things. On the cure versus treatment in HIV, a couple of things to say. One of the relatively recent discoveries, there was this NIH trial that came out probably about 2 years ago now, that basically shows if your viral load is undetectable, then you can reduce the risk of transmission between serodiscordant couples by something like 98%. And the idea there being that actually we know now, and we didn't know before, that the key thing is to control your viral load. And if you can get your viral load to undetectable, then you're far less infectious for other people. And I think that's a real breakthrough in terms of our understanding of HIV and ways of actually ending the epidemic. Because if we get people on treatment earlier with better drugs, we know that they're adhering to their treatment, they're far less likely to transmit the disease as well. But also, there are newer and better drugs. If we can keep people on, just to comment, because you were kind of indicating, treatment doesn't work very well and there are lots of side effects. It's true, some of the older treatments have far more side effects than the newer treatments, but actually a lot of people are able to manage their condition pretty effectively with HIV treatment. And the risk or the need to graduate from first to second line is going down as people are able to stay on good backbone regimens. So that's one thing. And then on the cure side, in terms of what's the motivation? Well, the motivation for cure is never going to be profit. because your profits are in selling someone a drug for the rest of their lives. You know, that, I mean, very frankly speaking. So I think all the motivation and all the drive towards a cure has been science-driven, curiosity-driven, and it's about what's really needed rather than what's going to be most profitable. But at the moment, it's not that exciting in terms of, we're not sort of a couple of years away from coming up with a cure, because actually where they've managed to find people, it's been like, I don't know, very costly, like bone marrow transplants or something. It's not the sort of thing that we can be like, right, okay, and it's very high risk as well, high risk in the procedure, so it's not like the sort of thing that we can sort of roll out tomorrow. So I think we do still, I mean, don't talk down treatment is working really well. Viral load suppression is really important, and a cure, yes, let's work in that direction. There have been some breakthroughs, but we're not there yet. And on the open source dividend, one of the ideas, I guess, could be to put it in the WHO. You can have scientific committees in the WHO that all would be relatively, well, could be trusted. You know, we use WHO to convene scientific committees to come up with treatment guidelines, or to give expert decisions on new drugs or new diagnostics, for example. So I think you could have, that would be a sort of legitimate intergovernmental body where you could place some sort of committee that could make these judgments. And I do think there's potentially some scope there in terms of some of these discussions about R&D financing coordination that are going on at the moment. If they do decide to set up something within the WHO, they would have to expand the mandate of anything they have at the moment, like the TBR, the Tropical Disease Research, could potentially play that kind of role, but only if its mandate was broadened beyond tropical diseases, because I think everyone here at least agrees that developing countries aren't only burdened by those kinds of diseases, although they obviously are as well. But then the question would be, you need the political will behind it, because unfortunately, when I was looking last week, I spent the whole week at the WHO looking at decisions that were being passed, and for a lot of them, there's no money. They say, you know, how much will it cost to implement this resolution? 9.6 million in the next year. How much of this have you secured already? None. What's your action plan? Fundraise for this through voluntary financing. So, I think we all know quite well that where wealthy states or big philanthropies like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are the largest voluntary contributor to the WHO at the moment, if they want to see something move forward, then that thing can move forward because they can give specified funds towards it. Whereas something like an open source dividend, the political will would need to be matched by financial will as well, unfortunately. Otherwise it's probably going to sit there not really doing much. Even these demonstration projects that have just been approved, there's nothing in the resolution that was passed in terms of the financial, they have to give these financing sheets of how much will this cost us. Their estimate is 700,000, 300,000 of which is activities, 400,000 is staffing costs, and none of it's going to go towards setting up the projects. So, because that would cost far, far more money. There's just not that level of ambition there at the moment, which is a bit disappointing. So we'd have to change the dynamic, but I think it does have that potential.
And I'd like to give a quick thing on the successful examples, and then the open source dividend requires some comment. This is not directly related to medicine, but in June of this year, the UN adopted a treaty on copyright exceptions for blind people, the Marrakesh Treaty. It was the first treaty in copyright that was a human rights instrument, and it was a user rights agreement. And it had huge opposition from General Electric, Monsanto, Exxon, GSK, like all publishers, the motion picture industry, and everything like that. There was probably 100 people at most that worked on this, and probably 24 people that really worked on it. David was one of the most instrumental persons on this treaty. What really made a difference in that was the blind people showing up to the negotiations, and it just transformed a whole UN agency for a period of time. It was quite moving to watch that thing through. There was like no press coverage for the most part. There was not a single story in the New York Times over a 5-year negotiation, including when the treaty was adopted. It was signed by the most countries. On the first day it was open for signature, it was signed by, I think, 51 countries, which was a record for any intellectual property agreement. And the U.S. has now signed the agreement after opposing negotiations for 5 years. So that shows you that I think a small group depending on how you count them, between 25 and 100 people can change the world. That's really all it really takes, in my opinion, to do something big like that. Now, but it was a focus, you know, and there was also a very high, clear moral message about what needed to be, and this sort of policy wonk stuff was done well too, so you know, everything kind of operated ideally. It was a balanced negotiation. You had good activity in Europe, good activity in the United States, and you know, it sort of working at the back, and in all the developing countries had very strong teams. Now, as far as the open source dividend, now imagine, suppose, I'll just give you an illustration starting with like Europe. Suppose that Europe passed a rule that said that 1% of the pharmaceutical turnover in Europe, and through a directive, would have to be transferred from the companies that sold the drugs to people who open source research that they benefited from on an unlicensed basis in developing their products. One of the issues the European Union would ask is whether or not you give the money to non-Europeans. That would be kind of an issue. Or whether you give the money, you know, just to European researchers. And that would be kind of an internal decision, because it would depend on whether you're trying to incentivize more product development, or whether or not you're trying to basically build up European research institutes. So that's the kind of thing you have to do. But how would you do the evaluation? It would not be that difficult, I don't think. What we proposed was that when a product would hit the market, that you would advertise that a qualifying innovation had hit the market, and then you'd ask people to submit evidence of whatever they thought was eligible for the open source dividend. And the criteria would be some kind of scientific information, data, technology, knowledge that was based on the thing. So people could put in, they could say, well, the Human Genome Project itself, you know, laid the foundation for it, or this paper by the scientist in such and such, or it was this thing in Nature, or it was this data set, or people could make whatever argument they wanted. Then the idea is that a jury would be appointed, where the jurors would not be known in advance, they would be other juries. You wouldn't be able to lobby them in advance. And they'd be, you could possibly have kind of a decentralized system where they'd be, maybe picked from different professional societies or something like that. But the jury then would be convened and be given a time-limited period to evaluate the evidence and make a decision and basically award shares to the different claimants. Now, would they get it right? No, they wouldn't get it exactly right, because there would be no right way, because you'd have like 5 people, they'd have 5 different opinions on how you should allocate it, and there'd be, you know, probably some hard feelings, but amongst people. But what would be important was that over a period, the process was perceived as fair enough and not corrupt, and so the idea was that the government could reject the report of the first panel and panel the second one. It's kind of a mechanical detail, but the jury system was the core of it. That you take people that they consider it, just like they already do this with grants and things like that, their review process for grants and things like that. They kind of, and over time the feeling was that, you know, that they get better at it as they sort of learn by doing. But the good thing, why you kind of expect some goodwill among the academics, because they would know that this machine would be raining money on them every year. So it would be kind of considered a positive innovation on policy, because it would be rewarding them for what they don't get rewarded for now, is their uncompensated role in making this bonanza, commercial bonanza, available by a company. And it would not, it would be, you know, so that would be kind of the basic thing. Now, within the context of the WHO process, there were some open source dividend proposals done, but they were primarily, for the most part, global type initiatives where the residency of the researcher was not really an issue. If Europe was to implement this through a directive, the first thing we might think about is, could we then lobby the Americans to do the same thing, because we've been giving, if we're giving money to Americans, why aren't our researchers getting money, you know, from the American market or something? The people begin to think of the trade-related aspect of the open source dividend. But from the company point of view, I want you to just think of, here's the downside for the company. They have to pay money that they're getting not to themselves, but to a third party. So that's like the negative. But what's the positive side? All the things they're paying for, they paid no royalties on. So to the extent that people license freely instead of charging money for it, the company's own cost of acquiring intellectual property, new product development, goes down. So if you were to say to a company, would you rather pay 3%, 1 or 2 or 3% into an open source dividend, but then look at all what you get back for it. What you get back for it is just, right now, they say that the universities are harder to deal with than companies in the United States. They say they're more aggressive, and they have like kind of an inflated sense of what every patent's worth and stuff like that. The companies complain about that kind of thing.
They'll tell them to, that's fine.
That's right. So this would be like a completely nuclear option for the Bayh-Dole Act because you'd essentially be competing against the Bayh-Dole Act with the open source dividend. And I think that the academic researchers, many of them would shift away from the Bayh-Dole approach to the open source dividend approach. But the companies, I think, would be open to it because it would lower their cost of acquiring the technology in the first place. So you'd speed up the rate of innovation by having more open data and more sharing of information, and the science would be stronger, and that would help your pipeline too, because they have problems in that area. Because they're trying to solve a lot of problems, as Sir John mentioned, not all of which are huge quantum leaps in terms of the welfare of the patients. And this would make it easier to get access to, to insights into things that would have bigger inputs, and it would lower the cost of acquiring technology. And I think if UAEM Europe wanted to work on a directive, it would be a cool campaign because, even if you didn't get the directive, you learn the political process in a way that would be very concrete, and it'd be something that you'd remember the rest of your life. It'd be a cool thing. Plus, you'd work with David, who's like a master at the European Parliament.
Welcome. It's 2 hours away to Brussels by Eurostar. That's good.
Well, I'm very conscious of the time. We're already well over an hour over our forecast at finishing time. So could we please show our huge thanks to our